Okay, so thank you for joining me today. This panel discussion is hosted by Tigray Youth Network, and the aim of the panel will be to discuss and explore the role of language in the war on Tigray and how it's been used to justify the attacks waged against the Tigrayan people. So at present, the war in Tigray has reached 12 months. The past year has seen indiscriminate attacks against the Tigrayan people orchestrated by Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali against the Tigrayan people. And this has been in collaboration with the allied forces, so Ethiopian National Defense Forces, Eritrean Defense Forces, Amhara Militia, and Special Forces. They have unleashed unprecedented violence against the Tigrayan population, and the war has resulted in an unimaginable humanitarian crisis with famine gripping the region. Dehumanizing language often precedes genocide, as seen in the case of the Rwandan genocide, where the Hutu majority used a popular radio station to refer to the Tutsi minority in Rwanda as cockroaches. As support for this characterization grew among the Hutus, it essentially stripped away any moral obligation to see Tutsis as their compatriots or as fellow humans. History shows that once a pattern of dehumanizing language has been normalized, it strips people of their dignity, thus permitting atrocities to take place with the support of the majority and very little, if any, condemnation. Genocidal language and othering sets the precedent for a sense of justification in any violence or hateful act aimed at the dehumanized group. The panelists joining me today are Professor Tronvoll, who is a professor of peace and conflict studies at Oslo New University College and a director of Oslo Analytics. We also have Dr. who holds a PhD in political science and international development at the University of Guelph. In completing his dissertation, Dr. Wight spent 18 months in Ethiopia on 3 separate trips from 2014 to 2019 while researching the South Sudan peace process. Thank you both for joining me today. My first question is to Patrick. Once a group is dehumanized, they are usually denied the consideration, compassion, and empathy that's typically afforded to other people and eventually alters any aversion to aggression or violence. Would you agree with this assertion, and can you give any examples of this?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree that dehumanizing language is often precedes genocide by many years, and it's often the first sign that that's where things are headed. In terms of past examples, historically, this has always been the case. Like even under slavery, there was dehumanizing language used to justify treating people as like non-human, effectively, right? Also during the Holocaust, the Nazis often referred to Jews as rats. So you'll commonly see this referring to people as some form of sort of insidious animal. In Rwanda, the Tutsis were often called inyenzi or cockroach. And there was also all sorts of myths that were used or invented to justify the genocide. So the most famous one in the case of Rwanda was what's called the Hamitic theory, which came from colonial times when the German and British colonial powers sort of defined the Tutsis as the higher race because they were taller, they were skinnier, they were lighter skinned. And so there was this theory invented that they came from the north, actually from Ethiopia. And during the genocide, the Hutu genocidaire would often, when they were throwing the Tutsi into the rivers, they would say, "We're sending you back to Ethiopia, where you came from." And so these are the types of dehumanizing language and myths that are often used to justify genocide. In the case of Ethiopia and Tigray, this rhetoric goes back a very long time. I mean, the most prominent example that I can think of is Eskinder Nega, who now is in prison, and I would say in many ways unjustifiably so. But this is also a man who was the editor of different publications that directly called for Tigrayans to be treated as the Germans treated the Jews in the 1930s. So, I mean, so this has been building in terms of when the TPLF had most of the power in Ethiopia, this sort of rhetoric was sort of seething under the surface in many ways. when Abiy Ahmed came to power, you saw these sort of language becoming more prominent as well. He would often refer to the TPLF as daytime hyenas, but of course, then because many Tigrayans support the TPLF, the net becomes broader, and it becomes pretty much all Tigrayans are viewed as sort of these people that you need to watch out for. I saw it myself. The last time I was in Ethiopia was 2019, and I saw the idea of like even using the word Tigray or Tigrayan was sort of became a dirty word. When you would say it, people would be sort of like hush hush, like, oh, don't say that, you know? And I was like, I'd been in Ethiopia many years prior, and that was never the case before. So it was something that I really noticed that had changed. And I heard people who were living in Bahir Dar telling me that there's people talking about cleaning up the area. It was this common phrase that's used. We need to clean it up, you know? And in recent days, we've seen a lot of really, really sort of dangerous rhetoric being used. So I've taken a couple quotes I just want to say that in the last couple of days that we've seen. So activist Dejen Asefa, he said, "The war is with the neighbor who grew up with you, has sided with their ethnic group, declared your people as an enemy, and is waiting for your death. The war is not only with the invading army that came from Tigray, but also with the one next to you. If you can weed out and control these ones, the victory is yours." And another example that we saw recently was from Mesai Mekonnen, who's a journalist for ESAT. He essentially called for all Tigrayans to be put in concentration camps in a way similar to what was happened to the Japanese in Western countries during World War II. He directly said this, and there was actually a lot of support that I saw generated for this proposal online. And Mesai Mekonnen is the same man who previously called for using a strategy of drain the ocean to catch the fish, which is a very famous phrase that was used by Mengistu previously when he starved out the people of Eritrea and Tigray. And so this is the type of dangerous rhetoric that we're seeing proliferating when it comes to the Tigray conflict, and it's only growing. You're seeing with the advance of the TDF in Desse and Kambolcha, you're seeing people saying that there's 30,000 Tigrayans in Desse, and these people are all your enemy, and so we need to put them in concentration camps so that we can sort of fortify the nation against this enemy population. And so it's very dangerous rhetoric, and it's already led to mass killings. But my fear is that now that the Ethiopian army is being defeated, that it's going to be ramped up. Like that's what you saw in World War II, was when the Nazis were facing defeat, that's when they ramped up the killing of Jewish people in concentration camps. So that's obviously something that we need to look at going forward.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for your insight. So dehumanization, as you mentioned, of a group can be associated with an increased willingness to perpetrate violence, and at its most extreme, dehumanizing messages and propaganda can facilitate support for war and genocide, as we're seeing in Tigray. And it's long been used to justify violence and destruction of minorities. We famously saw that in the Holocaust, as you mentioned, with Nazi propaganda referring to Jewish people as vermin, and during the Rwandan genocide. And so it's clear that dehumanizing speech is one of the precursors to genocide. And so my question to Professor Tronvoll is, what role do you think language has played in inciting and normalizing the attacks against Tigrayans in Ethiopia?
Well, I think it has played a crucial role. Language and terminology are what we use to make sense of our surroundings, and also to classify and categorize our relationship with collectives of others, be that friends or foes. And we have seen a very deliberate use of language in a way of othering the adversary, to make it subhuman or to make it very alien towards the in-group. And in the Ethiopian case, that started way before the current war, as Patrick has also mentioned, and particularly by certain diaspora environments in DC. ESAT, as you mentioned, that's probably the prime organizational platform where where the language were deliberately phrased in order to other the Tigrayans from the rest of Ethiopia, and to label them as enemies within, and to phrase them as kind of a legal targets for whatever kind of actions you could throw their way. And that was a gradual build up to the war. It started already in 2015, 2016, the ESA programming and very deliberate targeting of the Tigrayan communities in Ethiopia in this regard, and intensified after Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018, and has built on from there. And we have seen also then the language used by the ESAT and the ESAT reporting, how that has again been picked up by other social media activists, and also have been coordinated with Eritrean troll fabrics, and then played back again to the government narratives, so to say, how they have spun the narrative of the war after it started. So certainly language and the terminology we use to describe and to make sense of our understandings, of our surroundings, are playing into also alienating certain groups of people from the body politics of Ethiopia, and then making them susceptible for the attacks and the atrocities we have seen carried out over the last 2 years, or over the last year, sorry.
Thank you for that. So as you both have mentioned, the genocidal rhetoric, or the dehumanizing language used against Tigrayans can be traced years back, prior to Abiy Ahmed's appointment. And so I would like to ask Patrick if he feels that, if he agrees that history shows an established pattern seen with other communities that have experienced genocide, that language often precedes genocide. And in the case of Tigray, a region that has faced attacks during Menelik II, Emperor Haile Selassie, and Mengistu Haile Mariam, do you think the genocidal language used in regards to Tigrayans is symptomatic of a larger societal issue? For instance, an attempt to dismantle, pull apart Tigray's long-held desire and history of self-governance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that it's sort of emblematic of a larger problem with the nature of the Ethiopian state. I feel like the Tigray War is sort of like the latest example of that, but it dates back to sort of the formation of the Ethiopian state, particularly during the time of Menelik II and thereafter. The state was formed in a very violent way, in a way that sought to sort of destroy the autonomy and sort of cultural rights in a lot of ways of communities that weren't representative of the central state ideology. And so you see a constant effort to centralize power and to create this national identity by force. And so any subnational group that stands up against the central state and the central state ideology is treated as an enemy community that needs to be eliminated. So this was the case in 1943 during the Wayane, the revolt against Haile Selassie, where he enlisted the British Air Force to put it down, and then punished Tigray by taking various lands away from it. Haile Selassie did the same when Eritrea revolted in 1961, and that led to 30 years of civil war. Also, Mengistu, when Tigray revolted in 1975, and the TPLF was formed, you had the same reaction. And in the end, there was, estimates that you often see is that 1.2 million people were purposely starved to death in Eritrea and Tigray during those times. And there's also a long history of the Oromo being treated as sort of a barrier to state formation. So anytime an Oromo person sort of identifies with their subnational identity, or asserts their traditional culture, political structures, their language rights, their land rights, talks about autonomy rights for a region within Ethiopia, they get often treated as enemies of the state. So inherently state formation in every context, this isn't unique to Ethiopia. In Canada, it was the same thing. In Europe, it was the same thing. But state formation is an attempt to unify a group into a political project. But this is generally like an assimilationist project built on consolidating power. And it's often done to the benefit of a small elite. And oftentimes it's done through the destruction of indigenous cultures. And Tigray always had a sort of special position within, like, whatever you want to call it, the Ethiopian Abyssinian Empire, because they were very strong, but there was also competition with the sort of elites from what is today the Amhara region, you know, before it was Wollo and Showa. So they always sort of asserted themselves, and in doing so had sort of participated in the empire building project and had sort of special rights, land rights within it, but also were always seen as sort of a population that needed to be controlled in many ways.
Thank you for that. That was really insightful. So Professor Tronvoll, you briefly mentioned ESAT and the role of diaspora-based initiatives and networks. And so with ESAT, they have long held and long since perpetuated genocidal rhetoric, with the infamous quote of "drain the sea to kill the fish," and calls for 95% of Ethiopians to exterminate the 5% of Tigrayans. And this was said while the EPRDF were in government. Do you think this is indicative of a long-held intent to call for the extermination of Tigrayans, and what does it indicate about the wider Ethiopian state of society?
I think the ESAT case is a contemporary case of an which we see unfolding, but it has roots in the sense of how Ethiopian politics has been framed and phrased for decades, if not centuries for that matter. And we can go back to the wars of the 1970s and 80s, where all the resistant fronts at that time, including TPLF, used a lot of efforts and resources to ideologize and to discuss who are the allies of the revolution and who are the enemies of the revolution, as seen from their own point of view. TPLF, for instance, identified both the class structure, where you had the landowners, the bourgeois, and the rich peasants as enemies of the revolution, and the poor and middle-class peasants could be seen as allies of the revolution. But more importantly, they stressed the issues of nationalities as the main confrontation in the Ethiopian political landscape, and by that identified the Amharized elite as the main adversary to their own struggle for political and cultural autonomy. And I'm not saying Amhara as such, but the Amharized elite, the ruling clique. That phrasing and that framing was very deliberate by TPLF in order to mobilize support for their revolution. And you saw the changing rhetoric, and I wrote a book about that after the 1998-2000 war, called War and the Politics of Identity in Ethiopia, where you see how political elites engineer who should become the enemy and who should become allies, so to say, in a very rapidly shifting landscape. A war will open up where the Amharas and Amhara elite, so to say, were reclassified as from enemy to friend, because the Eritreans, who used to be called allies and friends, suddenly became the enemy. So these categories, although they may seem very fixed and durable, are quite the opposite. They are socially constructed and socially engineered in a way which makes them malleable and flexible according to the political context they do appear in. The current situation in Ethiopia, however, is quite different from former wars we have seen and experienced in modern history. And I think the entrenchment of enemy images, the genocidal language used, and not only the language, the actual implementation of genocidal intent is something quite new in Ethiopian body politics. So I think the deep divisions created today will be very hard to overcome in the near future. So it truly has an impact, and it is driven again by a rather small elite. Some in diaspora, very key contributors to the genocidal rhetoric, are located in Washington, D.C., for instance, in Esat and that environment. But again, it's picked up and amplified by the social media we have today, which is also a new phenomenon. Going back to the former war in 1998-2000, there was no social media activist as such, because Facebook didn't exist and Twitter didn't exist. So it very much exacerbates and strengthens the hostile discourse, obviously, and that is again then converted down to actual practice on the ground in Ethiopia with the ethnic stigmatization of Tigrayans across the country we see today. So it is that kind of interlinkage between the social media role and the political actors inside the country and the warring itself, which I think will have a more durable impact on how identities are understood and how divisions are becoming maybe more permanent. The outcome of the current war is hard to see today. It can be reconciled in a sense of a new coming together process in the aftermath of this war. I will not totally discard it, but I think it will be extremely hard to see that kind of reconceptualization of a new or of a new phase of Ethiopian identity after this war, as we have seen earlier then, so to say.
Yeah, no, I very much agree that things are shifting and things are exacerbated by a number of factors, namely social media. And that links to my next question. And so Daniel Kabrat, who is a deacon, but also the social affairs advisor to Abiy Ahmed, recently called for Tigrayans to be erased from the human mind and historical records to ensure anyone who wants to study them would be unable to. When asked by Western media to clarify who he was referring to, he said the government of Tigray. My question to Patrick is, what do you think the implications are of using these two entities interchangeably?
Yeah, so you've seen a lot of sort of ambiguity between TPLF as a political organization and the Tigrayan people writ large. So part of the sort of confusion comes from the fact that obviously compared to the rest of Ethiopia, there's a large amount of support within Tigray and the Tigrayan community for TPLF and for the EPRDF government. But there's a step that's often then taken in the discourse where then a degree of support for the TPLF, which for Tigrayans makes a lot of sense in the sense that all communities tend to support the people with guns who are protecting their community. It's just sort of a natural response, right? But then it gets pushed to that next level where, because there's a level of support for the TPLF, all Tigrayans, in a sense, in the minds of many, become TPLF. And so then there's this language where they're always playing a sort of double game where they'll say these things and it's pretty clear they're talking about the Tigrayan community writ large, but then when you push back on it. It's no, we're just talking about TPLF. I mean, initially this war was sold to us as a law enforcement exercise against a few TPLF elites. You know, they identified at first something like 76 people. They said, we're just going in to get these few people. It's gonna be a very quick exercise. You know, we're gonna be in and out of there in a couple of weeks. And it sort of devolved into what many observers describe as a genocidal campaign. Now, we can debate whether Abiy Ahmed himself had genocidal intent, or, you know, if that was his objective, but he allied himself to forces, Eritrea, Amhara special forces, and militias like Fano in particular, that had many members within their community that I think had a much deeper level of hatred towards Tigrayans. And this is what was unleashed on Tigray. But we're also seeing Tigrayans around the country being treated as enemies, being fired from their jobs, being put in prison. We're seeing calls for, you know, Tigrayans in Addis Ababa to be put in prison, having their bank accounts frozen, bank accounts that were opened in Tigray. There's all sorts of measures that are happening where it sort of belies the idea that this is just a war on a few political elites within the TPLF. This has really become, because Tigrayans are seen as supporting the TPLF, which to a large degree is true, but then the net gets broadened out and the entire Tigrayan community becomes an enemy that needs to be dealt with.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this war in itself has proven how dangerous it is to use terms interchangeably at your convenience or at the convenience of the Ethiopian government. And I think it's been a war of narratives, a war of conflicting realities. And so one of the most conflicting or the most dangerous claims, I feel, is the popular narrative that this war began based off an attack on the Northern Command as the genesis of this war. And the Ethiopian government has effectively skewed the narrative to depict themselves as being provoked rather than the aggressor. And so, Professor Tronvoll, do you think this has made this narrative, the Ethiopian government perpetuating this narrative, has made it a lot more difficult for Tigrayans to be seen as legitimate in the claim that this is a genocidal war?
Yes, certainly so, I think, because it has been repeated endlessly, and a share of international media and certainly a big segment of international diplomats have bought into that narrative as a fact, and have then totally discarded the empirical reality that this war has been in the making for, you know, a year, at least a year and a half or 2 years before the outbreak of the actual hostilities on 4th of November. For instance, the embargo put upon Tigray regional state by Amhara regional state from 2017 already, with blocking the main thoroughfares from Addis to Mekele, blocking any kind of transport of goods or people into Tigray, so they had to detour through Afar, and a lot of other actions of chasing out Tigrayans living in Gondar. 10 to 15 to 20,000 Tigrayans had to flee back to Tigray, so to say, who have been living in the Gondar area for generations. So that narrative that the war started by the so-called attack on the Northern Command, in addition to the narrative presented by Patrick that, you know, the initial objective was a law and order operation to arrest a handful of top elite, when we certainly know that there at least were maybe 4 concrete objectives with the war to start with. You know, for the sake of argument, let's give Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed the benefit of the doubt then, to say that, okay, maybe he initially believed this was a police operation to arrest the TPLF leadership. But we certainly know that from day one, or a long-term plan from the Amhara political leadership, were to take back Western Tigray, Segeda and Wolkite. That was explicitly their objective with the war. And you saw that immediately, and you saw the resulting ethnic cleansing of it. We know that President Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea had his concrete objective of the war, and that was to inflict as much pain and suffering as possible on the Tigrayan population at large as a revenge for the loss of the 1998-2000 war. And we know possibly that the broader political elite surrounding Abiy Ahmed wanted to cut back TPLF to the rightful 6% size, so to say, and to marginalize them from political positions in Ethiopia at large. So there were minimum 4 concrete objectives with the start of the war, as seen from the adversaries of Tigray. So certainly that Northern Command narrative has shadowed the true causes, the true processes leading up to the war, which we can empirically point to and give empirical evidence to, that this is how the prelude to the outbreak of war were gathering momentum. It didn't start with the attack, so-called, on the Northern Command. The war had already started when the TPLF ordered, or when the Tigray government ordered the attack on the federal bases in Tigray.
Thank you. I'd like to speak a bit about the kind of terms used to describe Tigrayans by the Ethiopian government. So a few examples of the derogatory terms used to describe Tigrayans are, I think Patrick named a few: daytime hyenas, an invasive weed needing to be uprooted, and the cancer of Ethiopia. I feel as though the Ethiopian government laid the groundwork and capitalized off this pre-existing contempt held for Tigrayans, and I feel as though that's widely shared amongst the Amhara elite and their apathy to the suffering of their countrymen and women. Since his appointment, Abiy Ahmed and other government officials have demonized Tigrayans and the government of Tigray, referring to both as somehow being responsible for any ills that occurred under EPRDF. In doing so, they have been successful in legitimizing the attacks waged against Tigray. I'd like to ask Patrick, why do you think there has been very little condemnation from academics, civic societies, and religious leaders in Ethiopia? Do you feel this is a reflection of how well accepted anti-Tigrayan rhetoric is by these groups and also by wider society?
Yeah, in many ways, yeah. I mean, I would like to just make clear that, like, of course, the TPLF was the most powerful political force in Ethiopian politics from 1991 to 2018. And there's many acts that happened during that time that we should condemn. But what you're seeing is a use of those legitimate grievances and suffering that happened in those years, a use of it to target it directly towards not even just the TPLF elites, which were, of course, the most dominant member of the coalition, but there were other members of the coalition, but then towards Tigrayan people who, if you go to Tigray, you know, we're talking about mostly subsistence farmers. So the idea that, like, subsistence farmers in rural Tigray need to be punished for some reason because of, you know, abuses that happened in Oromia or Somali region during those years, I think, like, this is the type of political rhetoric or political logic that we're seeing used to justify this war. Like, of course, there's certain things that happen that we should denounce, but that's very different from saying we're going to take those grievances and use them to justify exacting revenge on, you know, the rural poor in Tigray, right? So, I mean, that was one of the major selling points for this war. And I feel like another part of it is that since the war broke out, there's this sort of, it's very hard to figure out what's actually happening in any case of massacre or violence in Ethiopia. And part of it in Tigray is because, you know, communications have been shut down, power has been blocked off, aid and other things have been restricted. And so it's very difficult to figure out what is actually happening. And the government has been playing on this both the sense of sort of resentment towards the TPLF leadership and using the lack of just information in general to basically say everything's lies. Like it's even to the extent that we have a video of Ethiopian soldiers murdering people and throwing them off cliffs, and people will say that, well, it was really, TPLF wearing uniforms and did, like, so the extent to which people are willing to believe these stories is actually quite, it's quite astonishing at times. And so I think it does, in many ways, it does reveal like certain anti-Tigrayan sentiments, and it also reveals, in a sense, how effective the government has been at controlling the narrative within Ethiopia and limiting information and constantly sort of twisting the story to its benefit. So I think, yeah, you haven't seen a lot of outrage expressed within like Addis Ababa elites and other elites. And that has been one of the things that I found most shocking, because like Ethiopia is a country that I previously loved and I saw the people in a very positive light. And there's a lot of people who I saw very positively who either are tacitly supporting the war or buying into the government's narrative in ways that I've found extremely troubling.
Thank you, Patrick. I think we're all in agreement that it is deeply troubling. My next question is to Professor Tronvoll. I would like to ask, why do you think there has been so many attempts at downplaying the severity of this war? I feel like there's an issue with the international community calling this by its name, that it's a genocide against Tigrayans, and why do you feel that is?
Well, I think it's two ways to approach it or to try to explain it. One is it's kind of a material context of the war. The fact that Ethiopian government has quite effectively managed to block off all access to on the ground information. And as the borders to Tigray core is all controlled by either federal forces, Amhara forces, or Eritrean forces, journalists, independent journalists, international journalists, or Ethiopian journalists for that matter, have been prevented to access Tigray to document the livelihoods of the situation inside the TDF controlled areas, and also have been prevented to do effective war journalism. And sadly, the news reality of the world today is that if it is not on videotape, it doesn't exist. And we see that the Ethiopia war today and the situation in Tigray is the world's biggest humanitarian catastrophe as we speak, and it's the world's biggest active war waged in Ethiopia today, and it's hardly mentioned in any international media whatsoever. So that, first of all, that effective news blockage by the Ethiopian government has also played into the complacency of international diplomacy. Diplomats doesn't want to rock the boat, to be frank. That's not their job. Their job is to maintain communications with whoever, also during war and hostilities. So generally, they are very reluctant to dig into and disclose atrocities and human rights violations and political crisis as such, because that might create more trouble for their own work and for their home governments, in a sense, because I often teach my students that for a diplomat, it's equally important to know what not to know, that there is to know what needs to be known. In the sense that if you know something is occurring, it obligates you to take action. And it's much better in certain contexts not to take action because it is just too difficult. And no matter what you do, it is very hard to influence the situation on the ground in wars like in Ethiopia today. So then you just spend political capital for no use. And that's any government or any diplomat are reluctant to do that. So it is a double effect. The fact that the Ethiopian government has very effectively prevented insight into the war, at the same time as diplomats are very reluctant to dig for insights into the war, has created this dearth of knowledge, so to say. And that's a tragedy in its own right, obviously, because if the global audience, if the global civil society doesn't get information about the atrocities happening in Ethiopia today, we cannot put pressure on our governments to put pressure on Ethiopian governments or any other actor or UN or EU or to take action. So it is a whole, chain reaction in the fact that we lack that news coverage of the war has created this silence, this more or less global silence on the atrocities taking place in Tigray. And it's a extremely tragic situation, and it's very hard to mobilize interest. And I'm trying, banging my head against the wall for over a year, for that matter, in order to attract international media or Norwegian media. This situation is not covered at all, more or less, in Norway. Although we do have a development partnership with Ethiopia, there's a lot of historical relations between Ethiopia and Norwegian missionaries and NGOs and academia and so on. But it is hardly mentioned, and it's the fact that we don't have film, we don't have journalists on the ground makes that complicated.
Yeah, I think Abiy Ahmed and the Ethiopian administration has been successful in their campaign of kind of coordinated silence and skewing the narrative to prevent the international community from wanting to be involved and from understanding the depth or the severity of the violence. I want to mention, shortly after his appointment, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed spoke of reforms intended to unify Ethiopia. And throughout his time as Prime Minister, we have seen that he has profited off of this grand idea of Ethiopian exceptionalism. He's used this to effectively ostracize those he believed are a threat to his unitary vision. And this mythologized version of Ethiopia has been used to justify a return to the country's imperial past. We've seen this with the mass use of the Derg era flag and a revisionist and oftentimes romanticized depiction of Mengistu Hailemariam, who is estimated to be responsible for the deaths of 500,000 to 2 million Ethiopians. I'd like to ask Patrick, where do you think this romanticization stems from?
Well, in a lot of ways, Abiy Ahmed and the core group around him have a lot of ties to the Derg. And I mean, if we're being honest, to a certain extent, that's the fault of the TPLF, in that the OPDO was created from Derg soldiers who were released. And then there was no allowance of Oromo forces to self-govern. But that being the case, in a lot of ways, his roots are just as much from the EPRDF era as they are from the Derg era. And one of the first worrying signs that I saw was that there was a couple of old Derg high officials who were in prison, or who were in the the Italian embassy. They'd been staying there for decades, and they were released and sort of pardoned. And you're seeing a lot of use of the imagery, even the way he dresses, the way he talks. The funny thing is that Mengistu Haile Mariam dressed his own sort of ideology up in Marxist-Leninism, when I think in many ways he was a military sort of fascist dictator who cloaked himself in what was convenient at the time. So you had the Cold War at the time. It was, you know, the Soviet Union against the United States. He took the side of the Soviet Union, so he was a Marxist-Leninist. But in many ways, I don't know how genuine he actually ascribed to those ideas, because many of the people that he murdered were actually, you know, Marxist-Leninists from the student movement. But Abiy Ahmed has taken on the ideology of sort of neoliberalism, and that's the funny thing, where he was courting the West at the beginning with, you know, political and economic liberalization, but in many ways I would sort of describe him as sort of like the neoliberal Mengistu in many ways, and the way he's acting is very similar. Like even when we're seeing public executions, like we saw that the young man in Oromia who had the gun placed around his neck, and just horrific signs. Like it brings back the image of like the Derg era, when they were putting white pieces of paper on people's back and executing them in public to try and scare the entire populace. Like I just see so many parallels between the two regimes. And the other parallel, like that you alluded to, is this idea of like Medamer, this idea of unity. For Mengistu Haile Mariam, it was Ethiopia Tiktem, Ethiopia first. But it's like in the Mengistu time, he was using the language, the rhetoric of class, whereas Abiy Ahmed, it's more just this sort of amorphous sort of unity. But what kind of unity is it when it's really like sort of creating a unified Ethiopian identity, but by sort of like treating anyone that doesn't ascribe to this automatically as sort of the enemy of the state that needs to be destroyed? And so he's cloaked himself in Pan-Africanism and this rhetoric of unity, but in many ways it's a facade, just like the way Mengistu's Marxism was a facade. Really, it's like he's trying to centralize power, and what the war is about, you know, trying to create a strong centralized state and identifying any group that is sort of a barrier to that as the enemy. And in that way, they're very similar.
Thank you, Patrick. I found it really insightful and interesting, the parallels that you were able to recognize between Mengistu Haile Mariam and Abiy, and the weaponization of these romantic Pan-African notions. And it's been really effective in kind of supporting his agenda. So this panel intended to dissect and explore and kind of unpack how loaded language can be in inciting state violence, in justifying othering of minorities, and the outright, you know, calling for the outright extermination of minorities such as Tigray. So to conclude, for my last question for Professor Tronvoll, given how instrumental the weaponization of language has been in the genocide against Tigrayans, and how important do you feel language is in reclaiming and counteracting the brutality inflicted upon the Tigrayan population?
Yes, I think we need a process of very conscious thinking in order to develop a new terminology post this war, so to say, when this war ends. Sadly, I don't think the war will end with TDF entering Addis Ababa and Abiy Ahmed is toppled. It may still very well continue, particularly in Amhara heartlands versus Tigray, and certainly from President Isaias and the Eritrean side versus Tigray. So it's a long way till we can see peace, so to say, or non-armed confrontations in the area. But nevertheless, I think it is extremely important for the Tigrayan intellectuals and Tigrayan community at large to think consciously about how to use language to reposition themselves in relationship with their relevant others in the region, be that West Ethiopia, or be that as part of Ethiopia, or be that in relations to Eritrea, and ordinary people if I can use that term, the masses, the ordinary Amhara peasants or Eritrean peasants or Afar pastoralists for that matter, to reconfigure social relationship and ties, and to reestablish social relationship and ties with your surroundings, because no matter the political military outcome of this situation, you will still be neighbors. You will still be living next door to each other. And you need to come to terms with that, no matter how hard that can be. And a conscious development of a terminology which pacify these relations and which normalizes these relations is extremely important. This will not happen immediately, obviously. It might take even a generation or two, but it needs to happen eventually. You need to come back to some kind of normalcy in terms of social interaction. If that may be across provincial borders or if it will be across international borders. We just have to wait and see what the political outcome of the situation will be. And that, of course, will also influence how you talk about, how you phrase, what kind of terminology you would use to classify your relevant others.
Thank you for that. And with that, we conclude the panel. So I'd like to thank you both for joining me for today's discussion, and to the viewers that have attended.